Good morning, y'all. Before I get into this story, I want to do something I do not always do at the top of a video, and that is clarify the headline itself, because I think being straight with y'all about exactly what happened is more important than chasing the most dramatic possible framing. The San Andreas Fault itself has not ruptured. Nothing new has physically happened along the fault line running through California as I am recording this. What has happened, and what genuinely has scientists using words like unprecedented and unlike anything seen before, is a discovery made on the San Andreas' geological twin, a fault on the other side of the world in Myanmar, and that discovery is forcing seismologists to fundamentally reconsider what they thought they understood about how faults like the San Andreas actually behave. I think that story, told honestly, is actually more interesting than a fabricated headline about California specifically. So let me walk y'all through exactly what was found, why it applies so directly to the San Andreas, and what it means for how we think about earthquake risk going forward. Let's start with the earthquake that made this discovery possible. On March the 28th, 2025, a magnitude 7 earthquake struck central Myanmar along a fault called the Sagaing Fault, killing thousands of people and causing widespread devastation across the region. I want to explain why researchers at Caltech, working thousands of miles away in California, immediately recognized this specific earthquake as an opportunity to learn something directly relevant to their own backyard, and it comes down to the type of fault involved. The Sagaing Fault is what geologists call a strike-slip fault, meaning the ground on either side of the fault line grinds slowly past each other horizontally in opposite directions, rather than one side thrusting up and over the other the way it does along a subduction zone. The San Andreas Fault, the one running the length of California, is also a strike-slip fault, and structurally, the two faults share remarkable similarities. Both are long, relatively straight fractures in the crust. Both accumulate stress steadily over long stretches of time between major ruptures, and both are considered by seismologists to be geologically mature faults, meaning they have well-developed, smooth fault surfaces built up over a very long history of repeated movement. Because of those shared characteristics, Caltech researchers, led by postdoctoral fellow Solène Antoine and Professor Jean-Philippe Avouac, saw the Myanmar earthquake as close to an ideal natural experiment for understanding how a fault just like the San Andreas actually behaves when it finally lets go. Here is where the genuinely unprecedented part of this story comes in. Going into this earthquake, seismologists had a specific expectation for how it would unfold, based on a well-established concept called the seismic gap hypothesis. That hypothesis holds that a section of a fault which has gone unusually long without a major rupture, essentially a gap in the historical earthquake record, is under elevated pressure to eventually slip and, in effect, catch up on the stress it has been accumulating. Along the Sagaing Fault, researchers had identified exactly this kind of gap, a roughly 300-kilometer stretch that had not produced a major earthquake since 1839, and the expectation was that a future rupture would primarily address that specific overdue section. When the magnitude 7 earthquake struck in March of 2025, it did rupture through that expected gap, which on its own would have simply confirmed the existing theory. But using an advanced satellite imaging technique that correlates optical and radar imagery captured before and after the earthquake to measure ground displacement with remarkable precision, the Caltech team discovered that the actual rupture extended far beyond that gap, ultimately slipping along more than 500 kilometers of the fault, well over 300 miles, with the eastern side of the fault shifting a net of about 3 meters relative to the western side across that entire enormous stretch. I want y'all to sit with that number for a second, because it is the heart of why this study has generated so much attention. The earthquake did not just fill in the overdue 300-kilometer gap the way the standard model predicted. It continued rupturing well beyond that gap, tearing back into sections of the fault that had already ruptured in earthquakes back in the 1930s. Sections that, according to the standard understanding of how these faults are supposed to behave, should not have needed to slip again so soon. Professor Avouac described the core implication of this finding directly, explaining that the study demonstrates future earthquakes might not simply repeat past known earthquakes, and that successive ruptures of a fault, even one considered as structurally simple as the Sagaing or the San Andreas, can look very different from one event to the next, sometimes releasing far more accumulated slip than the calculated deficit since the previous earthquake would have predicted. That is the unprecedented piece of this discovery. Not that a big earthquake happened, but that it broke the fundamental assumption underlying a huge portion of modern earthquake forecasting, the assumption that faults behave in a relatively consistent, predictable, repeatable way from one major rupture to the next. Let me explain why that assumption mattered so much in the first place, because I think it helps clarify exactly what has been upended here. A large share of earthquake hazard models, the kind used by emergency planners, building code authorities, and insurance companies to estimate the probability and severity of future earthquakes in a given region, are built by studying the historical pattern of past ruptures along a fault and using that pattern to estimate how future ruptures are likely to behave, including their probable length, their probable magnitude, and roughly how often they are likely to recur. That approach works reasonably well if faults do, in fact, behave consistently over time, rupturing similar segments in similar ways across successive earthquake cycles. What the sagging fault just demonstrated is that this consistency cannot be assumed. Professor Avwak put it plainly, noting that this particular section of sagging was identified as a seismic gap prone to producing a large earthquake, and while that expected earthquake did occur, it ended up being dramatically longer than anticipated, essentially re-rupturing segments that had already released their stress nearly a century earlier. The research team has described this pattern using the terms clustering and variable segmentation, meaning that instead of cleanly, predictably rupturing one defined segment at a time in an orderly sequence, a fault like this can behave in bursts, sometimes rupturing a single narrow gap, and sometimes, apparently without clear warning, breaking through neighboring segments as well and producing a dramatically larger event than the historical pattern alone would have suggested. So let's bring this directly back to California and the San Andreas, because this is exactly the question the Caltech team set out to answer with this research. Given how structurally similar the sagging and San Andreas faults are, both long, mature, strike-slip systems accumulating stress steadily over time, the implication is that the San Andreas may be just as capable of the same kind of unexpectedly long, unexpectedly large rupture as the sagging fault just proved itself to be. Professor Avwak addressed this directly, explaining that the message from this research is that a future San Andreas earthquake could potentially rupture a much larger stretch of the fault than historical earthquakes alone would predict, or alternatively could occur as a sequence of smaller earthquakes instead, and that distinguishing between those scenarios in advance is genuinely difficult with current science. That uncertainty is not a comfortable answer, and I do not want to pretend it is, but I think it is a far more honest and ultimately more useful takeaway than a simplified headline claiming California's fault has somehow already changed behavior, when what has actually changed is our scientific confidence in how predictable that behavior really is. I also want to connect this finding to something else I have covered on this channel recently, because I think it adds important context. Earlier this summer, a separate team of researchers led by geophysicist Liliane Burkhardt published a related study focused specifically on Cajun Pass, the junction northeast of Los Angeles where the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems converge. That research found that several fault segments near this junction have reached or exceeded their highest modeled stress levels in roughly 1,000 years, and it introduced the concept of an earthquake gate, a junction that can either confine a rupture to a single fault or allow it to jump across and combine with a second fault system, producing a dramatically larger combined earthquake. When you put these two pieces of research together, the picture that emerges is genuinely sobering, though again, I want to stress, not a prediction of imminent disaster. You have one study showing that the stress currently loaded into the San Andreas and San Jacinto systems is at record levels for the past millennium, and a completely separate study based on a real-world earthquake on a structurally similar fault on the other side of the planet, demonstrating that when a fault like this finally does rupture, it may not stay contained to the length or pattern that history alone would suggest. Neither study tells us when the next major California earthquake will occur. Together, they tell us that when it does occur, the range of plausible outcomes in terms of both the rupture's length and its ultimate magnitude may be considerably wider and potentially more severe than earthquake planning, based purely on the historical record would have anticipated. I think it is worth explaining a bit more about the actual technology that made the Myanmar discovery possible, because it represents a genuine leap forward in how seismologists study these events after the fact. The satellite correlation technique the Caltech team used, originally developed in Professor Avwak's own laboratory and now used widely across the field, works by taking detailed optical and radar images of the ground captured by satellites before an earthquake occurs, and then comparing them pixel by pixel against images captured after the earthquake. By precisely matching features on the ground across those two image sets, researchers can measure exactly how far the surface moved during the earthquake, down to a resolution of just a few meters across an area spanning hundreds of kilometers. That level of precision simply was not available for earthquakes that occurred decades or a century ago, which is part of why this level of rupture complexity had never been documented. This clearly before, even though geologists suspect similar behavior may have occurred during past earthquakes, for which the historical instrumentation simply was not good enough to capture it in this kind of detail. Researchers studying this same March 2025 event have separately described it as an unusually clean natural experiment, since the sagging fault's straight, geologically mature structure created close to ideal conditions for observing exactly how energy releases during a major continental rupture, conditions that rarely align this well in real-world earthquakes. I also want to spend a little more time explaining the geological history that made this whole discovery so striking, because I think the specific detail of the fault re-rupturing 1930s segments is easy to skim past without appreciating just how unusual it is. Sections of the Sauging Fault had already produced significant earthquakes back in the 1930s, and under the standard seismic gap framework, those particular segments were considered to have already released their accumulated stress at that time, meaning they were not expected to be primary candidates for slipping again for a long while afterward, since they had not had nearly as much time to build up new stress compared to the neighboring 300-kilometer gap that had gone quiet since 1839. Instead, the March 2025 rupture tore through both the overdue gap and those more recently active 1930s segments in a single connected event, which tells researchers that whatever governs exactly how far a rupture propagates once it starts is more complex and less directly tied to a simple stress accounting ledger than the field's standard models had assumed. Professor Avwak's own words capture this well. He described the situation as the earthquake catching up on its slip deficit and then some, a phrase that captures just how far this event exceeded the specific calculated expectation researchers had going in. I also want to zoom out for a moment and put this finding in the context of the broader global picture of strike-slip fault research, because the Sagaing and San Andreas faults are far from the only examples of this fault type carrying major hazard for the communities living along them. Turkey's North Anatolian Fault, New Zealand's Alpine Fault, and portions of the Denali Fault system in Alaska are all well-studied strike-slip faults that share meaningful structural similarities with both Sagaing and the San Andreas, and seismologists across all of these regions are now revisiting their own hazard models in light of what this Myanmar research demonstrated. This is part of a broader trend in earthquake science over roughly the past decade, where advances in satellite imaging and computational modeling are allowing researchers to study fault behavior with a level of precision and geographic scope that simply was not possible a generation ago. And time and again, that improved precision has revealed that these systems are more complex and their potential range of behavior is wider than the simplified models built primarily on sparse historical earthquake catalogs had suggested. That broader trend, more than any single earthquake in isolation, is really what I want you all to take away as the through line connecting this story to the Cajun Pass research I mentioned earlier. The scientific picture of how major strike-slip faults behave is actively being rewritten right now, and close to real time, as new data continues to come in. I also want to briefly touch on what the Myanmar earthquake's ground-level impact tells us, separate from the purely scientific rupture measurements, because it carries a practical lesson for anywhere else a similarly structured fault runs beneath a populated region. The 2025 Mandalay earthquake caused thousands of deaths and widespread structural collapse, and post-earthquake assessments consistently pointed to the same underlying vulnerability seen after major earthquakes worldwide: buildings and infrastructure that were not engineered to withstand strong, sustained shaking suffered dramatically worse outcomes than structures built to modern seismic codes. That lesson translates directly to California's situation, where building codes have improved substantially since the mid-20th century, but where a significant share of the state's older housing stock, along with critical infrastructure like older bridges, water systems, and unreinforced masonry buildings, was constructed before those stricter standards existed. If a future San Andreas rupture does end up longer and more energetic than historical precedent alone would predict, exactly the scenario this research raises as a genuine possibility. The buildings and infrastructure least prepared for that kind of event are precisely the ones retrofitting and building code enforcement programs have been working to address for years, which makes continued investment in those programs, at both the individual homeowner level and the broader civic level, more relevant now than ever. Let me bring this together and explain what I think this actually means for anybody living across California or anywhere else along a major strike-slip fault system. This research is not telling y'all to expect an earthquake tomorrow, and it is not telling y'all the San Andreas has somehow become more dangerous than it was last month. What it is telling us is that the tools scientists have long relied on to estimate the probable size and extent of a future major earthquake, tools built largely on the historical pattern of past ruptures, may be systematically underestimating just how large and how far-reaching that next rupture could actually be. That has real practical implications for how emergency planners, structural engineers, and infrastructure agencies think about worst-case scenario planning, since a hazard model that has been calibrated to expect a rupture similar in scale to past California earthquakes may need to be revisited in light of evidence that faults like this one are capable of considerably more. For everybody watching this video who lives across earthquake country, particularly across California, this research reinforces the same core message I always come back to on this channel when new seismic science comes out. Preparedness needs to be an ongoing habit built around the full plausible range of outcomes, not narrowly tailored to whatever the most recent historical earthquake happened to look like. That means having your household emergency kit stocked and current, knowing how to shut off utilities like gas and water if needed, securing heavy furniture and appliances that could topple during strong, sustained shaking, and understanding that a genuinely major rupture on a fault like the San Andreas could potentially affect a broader geographic area and produce longer, more sustained shaking than what past California earthquakes in living memory have demonstrated. If you found this breakdown helpful, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because I want to keep bringing y'all accurate, carefully sourced explanations of research like this, especially when the actual science gets easily distorted into misleading headlines online. Share this video with anybody you know living across California or anywhere else along a major fault system, because understanding what this research genuinely shows and being clear about what it does not claim is exactly the kind of information that helps people prepare thoughtfully rather than either panicking or dismissing the risk entirely. I will keep watching for updates as more research comes out of both the Sagaing and San Andreas fault systems, and I will bring you all the next piece of this story the moment there is something new to report. Stay informed, stay prepared, and I love y'all.